All right, so by 1800, we are now kind of the tail end of what we call the Federalist era. The population of the United States is about 90% rural, which is going to be in largely throughout the 1800s. The economic growth is increasingly moving towards a market-based economy. We'll talk about that in State or Two after the War of 1812. But the country is changing and it's growing, and we can see that in the start of the Jefferson's presidency. Now, Jefferson, again, was elected in 1800. Sometimes it's referred to as the Revolution of 1800. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First, Jefferson, when he's inaugurated, says that we're all Federalists, we're all Democratic Republicans, meaning he establishes this idea of the loyal opposition, that you can disagree with even the president of the United States and you're not a disloyal American, that it's okay. It's even sort of an American tradition to disagree with the president. And it doesn't mean you're any less American than anybody else. Number two, we establish the peaceful transfer of power. The idea that just because you lose an election, you do not perform a coup. You don't try to overthrow the government. You can disagree with the other side. That's fine. The Federalists could have easily just not allowed Jefferson to take over. They controlled the federal government. They controlled the military. They just told Jefferson no. But we get the idea of a peaceful transfer of power, and you go in and you try to win the next election by changing your policy positions. Three, Jefferson is going to shrink the national government. He is the candidate of a weak national government, and he's going to want to reduce the size of the government, make sure that there's no strong military that can perform a coup. This is going to become a problem later. This is where Washington, D.C., by the way, is established. It's a new federal city created after the Assumption Compromise, but it takes a few decades for it to actually be built up. Jefferson is the first president that actually lives there. He's seen as the people's president. We're going to later call this the age of universal white male suffrage. As the United States moves west, it becomes easier to buy land. The property restrictions that had been in place for most elections are going to slowly be removed, even at the same time they're disenfranchising others. Now, one interesting thing that happens is that John Adams knew he was going to not be president. He lost the election in November, but he's not going to leave office until February. There's this window of time where we call it a lame duck. He knows he's not going to be president, but he's still president. So he started writing a bunch of appointments for federal judges, both the Supreme Court and federal courts. And these are lifelong appointments. So these are Federalists that he would put in place. They would have a lifelong appointment that would continue to make Federalist decisions well after he's gone. One of these federal appointments was supposed to go to William Marbury, a lawyer, and he was told that he was supposed to get this appointment. But the problem is that John Adams was writing these appointments up to the last day in office. He left a stack of these appointments on his secretary's desk. Secretary, gosh, I can't remember. But anyways, the Secretary of State was supposed to deliver these letters. The Secretary of State didn't deliver all of them. So when Jefferson takes over, he tells his new Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver these letters to the appointments. Marbury knows that he's supposed to get the letter. He sues Madison, trying to get the letter delivered so he can become a federal judge. Marbury is a lawyer, so he takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. He takes it directly to the Supreme Court using the Judiciary Act of 1801. He asks for something referred to as a writ of mandamus, an order from the federal Supreme Court to make Madison deliver him the letter. The new Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall, knew that the Supreme Court was already weak. They had no enforcement mechanism. He could tell Madison to deliver the letter, but Madison would just ignore him. So he's worried that that's going to set a bad precedent, then the Supreme Court would be a weak third branch. So he comes up with a way around. Marshall looks at not the appointment letter, but the Judiciary Act of 1801 that gave him the power to issue the writ of mandamus. And he looks at the Judiciary Act, and then he looks at the Constitution, and he says, there is no writ of mandamus power given to me in the Constitution. Therefore, the Judiciary Act of 1801 has to be thrown out. it violates the Constitution. And we call that judicial review, declaring a law unconstitutional. So Marshall, ironically, a Federalist who wants to increase the power of the national government, strictly interprets the Constitution in order to establish judicial review, which is not a power given to the Supreme Court in the Constitution. He uses the power of judicial review to strengthen the national government for the rest of his time in office, which is the next 30 years or so. Ironically, Thomas Jefferson is going to be involved in his own little thing. Jefferson wanted access to this port right here in New Orleans. The United States had all the land of the Mississippi River, but they did not have access to New Orleans, as controlled by France. So they could put all of their products that they're growing over here in the Western Territories on the river, but they couldn't get it out to the national market. So Jefferson goes to the French, or actually sends his ambassadors to the French and asks to rent the port of New Orleans. And this is the point where in 1800, Haiti, which was a little island country down here, had just thrown off the colonial oppressors of the French, established the first successful slave rebellion. And the French were trying to retake it and failing miserably. So Napoleon, who's the leader of the French at that time, throws up his hands and says he wants out of North America. And he tells Jefferson he will sell the United States all of the Louisiana Purchase for like $10 million. It was a steal. The problem is that Jefferson has to violate his own strict interpretation beliefs because the Constitution does not say anywhere that the president can purchase land from other countries. So he loosely interprets the Constitution, buys the land, violates his own core beliefs, doubles the size of the United States, and now the United States has access to the entire Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, right here, which now gets the United States facing westward. They're not worried about Europe anymore, and they're going to start thinking about moving into the West. It's an opportunity for American farmers, and it's a way to get the United States expanding and growing crops. He does send the Lewis and Clark expedition out here. This is the Lewis and Clark expedition, and we often look at the Lewis and Clark expedition and we think of, wow, they're out in the wilderness. But remember, they actually hired a guide. Her name was Sacagawea, who was pregnant for most of the expedition. And Sacagawea was able to negotiate with the various tribes that they interact with along the way. And there's also Spanish people living out here on the coast. So yeah, it's a great achievement. But the Lewis and Clark expedition was facilitated by an indigenous population that allowed them to get all the way to that west coast. In Jefferson's second term, we have a few things that are a little bit more complicated. There is a division in the Republican Party. In 1808, there is the end of the international slave trade, which is great. The problem that, of course, being that it's not because they believed that slavery was wrong. They ended the enslavement system because they wanted the international slave trade, because they wanted to keep domestic prices high for the enslaved population. So think about it this way, supply and demand, right? So at this point, the enslaved population is a hereditary status, right? So if a enslaved woman has a child, that child, regardless of who the father is going to be an enslaved person. It's fairly easy to survive in the United States compared to, say, in the sugar plantations. So natural reproduction was growing the population of the enslaved population in North America. But they have the same amount of territory. So the supply is increasing, but demand is staying the same, which means price is going down. If you're also flooding the market with international enslaved people, then that's going to cause the prices to drop even further. So part of the reason why they ended the international slave trade was supply and demand, wanted to keep the price of domestic enslaved people high in the face of stagnant demand. The next step is to increase demand. That's going to be by expanding into the West. Let's talk real quick about the War of 1812. Now, it starts with the Napoleonic Wars of the 1800s. And Napoleon in France is going to be fighting Britain and Lord Wellington throughout the Jeffersonian period. Americans were being impressed onto British ships, which essentially means kidnapped, Anybody that was suspected of being a British citizen could be forced to work on that British ship. So what was happening is British warships were stopping American ships and just basically kidnapping any Americans and making them work on British ships. This was making Americans really mad. Jefferson is going to try to prevent this by issuing the embargo of 1808. In a sense, he just prevented all ocean-going traffic, which hurts the American economy, so much so that it's going to be repealed later on. But in the election of 1808, Democratic Republicans are still very popular. There is this drift towards war. Madison is elected, replacing his mentor, James Thomas Jefferson. There's a number of causes that lead to the War of 1812 with the British. Partially it's because Madison wasn't very good at international negotiations. The British are still impressing American soldiers. The British were violating American shipping rights. Madison was tricked into releasing the embargo for the French, but not the British, which made the British mad. Americans had this idea that they wanted to take over Canada. So there's all of this stuff that happens that leads and kind of pushes the Americans into the War of 1812. And then they realized it was really hard to get ready for the War of 1812 because Jefferson killed the national bank. So there wasn't really any way to quickly get the funding necessary for a military. He had also shrunk the size of the national government, which made the bureaucracy even harder. And then he also had a difficult time getting the military built up because they had this anti-military philosophy. There's a lot of stuff going on here that eventually is going to turn those Democratic Republicans into taking on some of the positions of the Federalists. There's not a whole lot to talk about the War of 1812. The war is going to end basically with the Americans and the British in exactly the same positions that they started. There is some fighting along the Chesapeake, which is in Virginia. In fact, the British burned down Washington, D.C. and the White House. There's a lot of stuff happening there. There's a pretty famous battle up in Lake Champlain, up in New York. But in the end, not a whole lot happens other than the Americans don't lose. The Treaty of Ghent is signed in 1814, basically returns everybody back to the pre-war status. But ironically, this is kind of like lancing a boil and the infection kind of goes away. After the War of 1812, the Americans see this as a second war of American Revolution. The British failed to defeat them again. So there's this wave of nationalism coming out of this. Oddly, the Americans and the British, their relationship improves after this. The British are going to help the Americans with the Monroe Doctrine. We'll see in a little bit. One famous battle is the Battle of New Orleans. This battle actually takes place after the Treaty of Ghent is signed, but communication was so bad that they didn't know it, that the war was over. Famously, the Americans defeat the British, losing only 2 soldiers. Andrew Jackson becomes a war hero, though. That's what's important that comes out of this. Andrew Jackson, a war hero. He's going to become a presidential candidate, and he has very strong presidential ambitions. We'll talk a lot about President Jackson in Standard 2. The other important thing is that there's something referred to as the Hartford Convention. Those Northern Federalists were trying to force the government to end the War of 1812 right about the time that the war was almost over, and it made them seem unpatriotic, and basically the party dies off. So after the War of 1812, there's really only Democratic Republicans left for a little while. And that's going to lead us into Standard 2 when we're going to see a new opposition party rise up referred to as the Whigs. And it's the Whig Party that's going to eventually transform into the Republican Party, which is going to become the party that's going to fight against the Southern Democrats and leads to the Civil War. So good times are coming. Thanks, folks.